They said the cries could be heard clear across the ridge that night. A girl's voice, torn open by something more than pain, echoing through the trees like an animal being slaughtered. When neighbors, what few there were, crept close enough to see, they found her writhing in the dirt outside the cabin, her nightgown soaked through with blood and moonlight. In her arms, she clutched a newborn that did not look right. Its skull bent in places no human skull should bend, its eyes too far apart, its mouth struggling for breath that did not come easy. Standing above her, watching with a gaze as hollow as the valley itself, was her brother, the father of that child. This was not the first time the hollows of Kentucky had heard screams from that cabin, but this was the first time anyone dared to speak of what those screams meant. And even then, the words traveled in whispers, carried by wind and shame, never loud enough to summon the law, never bold enough to summon God. Before I continue, a small request. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Share it below, so that these stories keep finding you, no matter how far from these mountains you live. Because what I am about to tell you isn't just mountain folklore. It is not rumor or ghost story. It is history, written in sealed files and burned into the dirt of forgotten cemeteries. The records were buried, the names erased, the graves left unmarked. But the hollows remember. They always remember. The eastern ridges of Kentucky have always been a place apart. Steep ravines cut the land into shadows that never see full daylight. Old maps mark the area with broken lines and half-finished trails, then give up entirely, as though even cartographers sensed the land did not want to be known. Families came here to disappear, some to escape war, some to hide debts, some because the mountains offered a kind of isolation that no sheriff's badge or preacher's sermon could easily penetrate. It was into this land that the Combs bloodline rooted itself. First a homestead, then a cluster of cabins, then nothing. No roads, no census marks, no marriage licenses filed. Just a family that kept to itself so completely that within a generation the lines between brother and husband, sister and mother, blurred into something unspeakable. By the time outsiders heard the first rumors, the rot had already set in too deep, and at the heart of it all was one daughter, Lily Mae Combs, born not of strangers, not even of cousins, but of siblings. She would grow to carry the curse of every sin committed before her, a curse that no one would dare name aloud until it was far too late. The first records of Lily Mae's birth were written in shaky pencil on the back of a torn ledger page, never meant to be official. October of 1925, the note read, delivered by her grandmother in a cabin that reeked of kerosene, wood smoke, and damp rot. No father listed, though everyone knew. Her mother was Sarah. Her father was James, brother and sister to each other. In the hollow, blood ran in circles, not lines. From the start, Lily Mae bore the marks of a child who should never have been. Her eyes sat too close together, her jaw narrow, her skin pale, with a grayish cast, as if the blood inside her carried less life than it ought. She was a quiet infant, but not in the way of peace, more in the way of resignation, as though she had entered the world already knowing it was a mistake. Growing up in that hollow, Lily Mae never knew the world beyond the ridges. Her family's existence was one of hunting, trapping, and coaxing poor soil into giving up corn. Their food rotted fast, their water came from streams that ran brown, and their laughter, when it came, had an edge that made outsiders uneasy. But outsiders rarely came. There were no schools, no doctors, no lawmen riding those paths. Just the preacher who passed through once a year, speaking of heaven to people who already knew hell. From an early age, Lily May learned the rules no child should ever have to learn. Do not draw attention when the men drink. Do not sleep too deep after the fire burns low. Do not scream, because screams carry in the hollows, and what they bring is never help. She would curl against the wallboards at night, listening to her father's footsteps and later, her brother's breathing just outside her door. Childhood ended for her before it had even begun. By the age of 8, she had already perfected invisibility. She could slip between shadows, make herself smaller than hunger, smaller than fear. Yet nothing could hide her from the curse carved into her family's blood. Her father James, who was also her uncle, had been born of a sister. Her mother Sarah, who was also her cousin, had been born of a brother. The lines tangled so tight that by the time Lily May drew breath, no one in that cabin could say for certain where one parent ended and another began. The neighbors, the rare ones who lived close enough to notice, spoke in whispers about the children's strange eyes. The way they never seemed to smile right, the way their laughter sounded just a shade too hollow. But whispers do not stop curses. They only carry them farther. And when Lily May's older brother William turned his attention toward her, the whispers turned to silence, because silence was safer than truth, and safer than truth was forgetting. The autumn of 1937 came early to the mountains. Frost clung to the edges of corn stalks, and smoke from wood stoves hung low in the valleys. Lily May was 12 years old. Her body small, her eyes dulled by a childhood that had never belonged to her. That was when William, her older brother, began watching her with a hunger that was not brotherly at all. In the hollow, there were no laws but silence. No one to say that what was about to happen was a crime. No one to tell William that his desire was a sickness passed down like a family heirloom. Their parents, Sarah and James, carried their own guilt in their bones. They looked away, the same way their parents had looked away before them. The cycle turned again, and Lily May became the next offering. That night, while the cabin's lantern burned low and their parents lay drunk on homemade liquor, William entered Lily May's room. The girl did not scream. Screaming had never brought help, only more punishment. She stayed silent, her face turned toward the wall, while the sound of floorboards creaked beneath the weight of her family's curse, pressing itself deeper into her life. By the following spring, the signs could no longer be hidden. At just 13 years old, Lily May's body swelled with the proof of her brother's violation. In the outside world, this would have been cause for alarm, for investigations and arrests. But the hollow was not the outside world. Here, it was simply life continuing as it always had. When her first child came in November of 1938, it was born wrong. Its head shaped like a caved-in skull, limbs twisted, mouth unable to form words. They named him Samuel. Though no records were ever written, he lived only in shadows, crawling weakly across the floor until his body gave out. His cries echoed through the cabin like broken prayers, prayers that reached no one. But William did not stop. If anything, the birth only emboldened him. The family did not forbid him, their silence became permission. By 1940, Lily May had borne another son. This one, Thomas, seemed more whole in body but less in mind. He rocked violently for hours, beat his head against walls, and made noises that resembled words only to those desperate to believe they were. Neighbors began whispering again, the whispers sharper now. Children that looked too much alike. Children that looked not quite human. The preacher came once more, saw the boy with his head bleeding from fresh wounds, and left without saying a word. The silence thickened, but silence cannot hold forever. By 1943, when the government census taker came trudging into the hollow for the war effort, he found what no form could categorize: children who could not name their own parents, a mother who was also a sister, a brother who was also a father. His report, clinical and restrained, could not hide the horror he felt. Yet, like the reports before it, it was buried in a drawer in Frankfurt. But paper cannot bury blood, and blood cannot bury screams. The war years brought change, even to the most hidden places, but the hollow clung stubbornly to its shadows. The census taker's words had been filed away, left to gather dust with all the other warnings. And so Lily May, barely 18, found herself cradling yet another child by her brother William. Each birth was like rolling dice against fate, and each time the dice came up cursed. By 1945, the cabin had grown crowded with small bodies that moved unnaturally. A boy whose fingers grew together like webbing. A girl who seized at the faintest sound. A child who never made eye contact, whose gaze wandered like it was searching for something that wasn't there. Each night, the hollows carried their cries, strangled, guttural, unearthly. Neighbors called them creature sounds, though few would admit it out loud. William had grown more violent with time. The liquor he drank by day stripped him raw by night. His fists landed wherever they fell, on walls, on children, on Lily May herself. She bore ribs that never healed right, a jaw that clicked when she spoke, fingers bent backward until they refused to straighten. Yet the violence never slowed the cycle. The family carried on as though the curse were survival itself. It was in 1947 that the silence finally cracked. A man named James Marion, a photographer from the city, wandered too far down an old hunting trail. He was sent to capture images of rural poverty, but what he found at the cabin was something else entirely. He later wrote of Lily May sitting on the porch, holding an infant whose skull was grotesquely swollen, twice the size of its fragile body. Behind her, in the shadows of the cabin, children moved like broken marionettes, jerky, unnatural, their eyes catching the light in ways that didn't seem human. The smell was thick, waste, rotting food, sickness that had seeped into the walls themselves. Marion could not bring himself to lift his camera. He left the trail in a panic and reported everything he had seen to the sheriff's office. For the first time in nearly a century, the Combs family secret was threatened by light. But when deputies arrived 3 days later, the cabin was empty, the hearth cold, the beds stripped, the forest paths disturbed by tracks that led nowhere. The family had vanished into the mountains, slipping back into the caves and abandoned mines like smoke into stone. The cabin stood silent, except for the rot that crept through its boards. For the next 5 years, they became phantoms. Farmers found signs that someone had slept in their barns. Hunters swore they glimpsed pale children darting through the trees at dusk. Sometimes the echoes of strange cries drifted from deep within the ridges. But no one ever saw the family whole. No one ever caught them, and no lawman dared chase shadows too far into those mountains. Yet the curse had not vanished. It had only gone deeper underground. The wilderness became their fortress. After fleeing the cabin, the Combs family scattered through caves and abandoned coal shafts, surviving like animals on whatever scraps they could steal or scavenge. The children, already twisted by years of inbreeding, grew more feral with each passing season. Their skin grew pale from lack of sunlight, their bodies thin and weary, their voices reduced to guttural cries and high-pitched wails that carried across the ridges at night. Hunters called it the mountain scream, a sound that made even the bravest men abandon their rifles and head for home before dark. Lily May, still barely a woman, was now the mother of more children than she could count. Some had died nameless, buried shallow under rocks or left in the woods for the earth to take back. Others clung to life in strange, broken ways, walking on all fours, chewing bark and clay, staring into nothing with eyes that reflected like glass. She tried to love them, tried to hold them, but her arms were always full, and her heart was always hollow. By 1952, whispers of the white ghosts of the hollows had spread into nearby towns. Farmers claimed livestock disappeared in the night, only to be found days later half-eaten, bones cracked open for marrow. Travelers along the back roads told of children with matted hair and blackened teeth watching them from the tree line, vanishing when confronted. The law was called again, but by then the family had become expert at vanishing. They moved from cave to cave, never staying in one place long enough for the sheriff to find them. Deputies who tracked too far often returned shaken, speaking of shadows moving in the brush, of rocks thrown from unseen hands, of the unmistakable sound of children giggling where no children should be. And then came the night of the fire. In the winter of 1954, a hunter's lantern set blaze to dry brush near one of the caves. Flames spread fast, devouring timber and smoke choking the ridge. When it was over, the hunters found bones scattered in the ash. Small bones. Human bones. But there were too many to count, and not enough to account for them all. The fire had swallowed something, but not everything. Tracks led away from the blackened earth, bare footprints, small and large, disappearing into the cold mud of the valley. For years after, locals swore the family had perished, but the screams never stopped. The cattle still went missing, and sometimes, on moonless nights, you could see pale figures moving between the trees, carrying with them the curse that had started generations before. The bloodline had not ended. It had only scattered further into the shadows of America. Decades passed, and the world beyond the mountains modernized, paved roads cut through valleys, and television flickered in homes that once knew only lanterns. But in the hollows where the Commom's bloodline had hidden, the old cycle still turned. Each generation blurred into the next. Brothers with sisters, fathers with daughters, mothers with sons, until names ceased to matter. They were simply the family, bound by blood and silence. By the 1970s, social workers and census men once again began pushing into the mountains. What they found was unfit for official records. Children with jaws that could not close properly, eyes that wandered in different directions, and speech that came out as guttural sounds instead of words. They wrote down mental deficiencies, severe congenital defects, unfit living conditions. But in truth, no paper could capture the horror of what inbreeding had done. One child in particular became the living embodiment of that curse. Born in the early 1960s, he had no name at first, just a sound, a grunt that was his only way of communicating. His head grew misshapen, his jaw slack, his eyes darting without focus. His legs were bowed, his body frail, yet he lived on, surviving into adulthood. He became known simply as the most inbred man alive. Neighbors who saw him described his presence as haunting. He could not speak, could not form coherent thoughts. Yet his screams echoed through the valleys like a living reminder of what had been buried. His life was a cycle of dependence, fed by his relatives, cared for in shadows, shielded from the world's eyes. He never knew a world beyond the hollow, never knew laws, never knew mercy. His existence was proof of what silence and secrecy had created. A body, and mind crushed under the weight of generations of sin. Authorities tried to intervene several times in the 1980s and 90s, but every report was stifled, tucked away as sensitive material. America preferred to bury the story rather than confront it. To admit that such a family lived in its backwoods was to admit a failure too large to face. And so the story lived only in whispers, passed between locals and investigators who had seen too much. The man survived into the 2000s, hidden, pitied, studied by a few who dared document him. His life was not a childhood, not even a tragedy. It was a wound carried across generations. He became the last face of the comms curse, a reminder that cycles of silence do not break themselves. Today, his story exists as a shadow in history. Half-forgotten reports, buried photographs, whispers of cries in the night. America buried it, because to remember it is to remember that monsters are not born. They are made by neglect, by silence, by bloodlines that feed on themselves. And so, the man who married his own mother, the family that vanished into the mountains, and the children born broken by blood, remain a stain on America's past, a truth too dark for history books, but too real to ever be erased.